Okay, so we will get started. I think people will continue to join. So let me welcome you to the Columbia Ethics Grand Rounds for the month of April. I'm Paul Appelbaum. I direct the Center for Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia, and I'm the Dollard Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law. I am completely delighted to welcome you to Ethics Grand Rounds. Today's session entitled The Geneticization of Education and Its Bioethical Implications. For those of you who are new, let me tell you a little bit about the Grand Rounds series, which is organized by the Division of Ethics and the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics here at Columbia. The goal is to engage our community of health professionals, scholars, scientists, trainees, across career stages and disciplines by centering important topics and debates in medical ethics that relate to clinical practice, research, implementation, and education. It's the hope of the organizing committee that attendees will leave each session with a greater understanding of the ethical and social implications of the topic that's being discussed. This series is co-led by Sandra Sujin Lee, who's professor and chief of the Division of Ethics and oversees today, and Lucas Matthews, our presenter, who I will tell you more about in just a minute. The series is the result of the efforts of the organizing committee, which comprises faculty, affiliated ethics division faculty, research and program staff, and they all deserve our thanks for their dedication to this series. So today's Ethics Grand Rounds, as I mentioned, is entitled The Geneticization of Education and Its Bioethical Implications, and it features Columbia University faculty member and Division of Ethics faculty member, Lucas Matthews, PhD. By way of background, in 2013, two researchers in the UK, Robert Plomin and Catherine Ashbury, published a book entitled G is for Genetics. They summarized in their book the behavioral genetic research to that point that suggested genetic influences on success in schooling, and they argued for what they then called personalized education, a more individualized approach to pedagogy that would be based, in part, on a pupil's genetic endowment. G is for genetics, which was highly controversial when it was published, was the harbinger of what today is often termed precision education, with efforts being made in several countries, as we're about to hear, to introduce approaches based on genetics into the classroom. Where that stands and what issues are raised by the geneticization of education are the topic of today's Grand Rounds. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just, by way of housekeeping, ask you to please check the chat for logistics and other information. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be uploaded as a resource to the Columbia Division of Ethics website following this event, and the link to this recording will be shared with all of you by email once it's available. Also, and this is important, immediately following this event, in 1 hour, there will be a 30-minute after party in a separate Zoom room. You can join there to continue the conversation, ask questions, connect with the speaker and with each other. And there will be a separate Zoom link for that session posted in the chat at the end of this event. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Lucas Matthews is a presidential scholar at the Hastings Center and an assistant professor of medical humanities and ethics at Columbia University Medical Center. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Utah, where he studied conceptual issues in evolutionary biology. Lucas then spent 3 years as a postdoctoral fellow in behavioral genetics with Eric Turkheimer at the University of Virginia, followed by a 2-year fellowship with our Center of Excellence in ELSI Research in the Columbia Department of Psychiatry. His latest research, for which he was awarded a K01 grant by the National Human Genome Research Institute, examines ethical, psychosocial, and political implications of the development and direct-to-consumer availability of genetic testing for educational outcomes such as intelligence, math ability, reading ability, and educational attainment. With that, let me turn it over to Lucas for today's presentation.
Thank you kindly for the introduction, Paul. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that audio working?
Yes.
Okay. And are my slides visible?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, Paul. I'm really excited to speak today about a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I have a lot to say, so I'm gonna jump right into it. Paul introduced Robert Plomin's G is for genes as some background context as a proposal, a controversial proposal for precision education that has been met by the academic community as sort of a provocative idea that's, mainly provocative but not very serious. What many people are not aware of is that a precision education initiative actually was initiated in New Haven, Connecticut. I believe it started in 2016 by a team of researchers at Yale University. It was referred to as the New Haven Lexinome Project, with Jeffrey Gruen as the principal investigator. And the New Haven Lexinome Project was part of a more general project to identify genetic variants associated with reading ability or reading disability and dyslexia. But there was a particular leg of this study that involved identifying first graders who were struggling in reading. They were performing in the bottom quartile. And for the students and families that agreed to participate, they collected D&I and they conducted MRIs. And they enrolled these students in an intensive reading intervention program that involved 5 years of in-person meetings with a trained educator twice a week. And the immediate goals of the project were to develop genetic prediction of poor reading performance, as well as a response to reading intervention, with a long-term goal of developing precision education initiatives. So why am I talking about the New Haven Lexinome Project? I'm talking about it because today I'd like to explore an idea that the NHLP is a signal of the geneticization of education, which poses another question. What do I mean by that? A really useful way of thinking about geneticization is to think about medicalization. And given that we're at Ethics Grand Rounds at the Medical Center, the audience might be more familiar with this idea, which can be defined broadly by the process by which human traits or conditions become defined, diagnosed, and treated as medical conditions. We might consider social anxiety as an example of this. There was a period of time in human history in which a certain portion of the population felt extremely uncomfortable in social settings, and this was just something that some people felt. At some point in time, social anxiety became defined and added to the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, and it has specific criteria, and it is diagnosable and treatable. And so it has become medicalized. It is now a thing. And there's sort of a background debate of whether medicalization is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm introducing the idea as analogous to geneticization, which we might define as the process by which human traits, outcomes, or abilities become defined, understood, and treated as genetic conditions. So a really nice example of this is educational attainment. This is the term that refers to the number of years a person has completed in their lifetime. And it's a very prevalent data point in data sets because every time you're at the doctor's office and you're filling out a survey in the waiting room, you typically answer this question about educational attainment. And interestingly, starting as early as 2013, geneticists began conducting genome-wide association studies of educational attainment with an eye for identifying variation at the level of the genome and DNA and variation in educational attainment. And in the earliest case of this, that had over 126,000 individuals that participated, the results were by and large disappointing in the sense that not a large number of variants were statistically significant, and their effect sizes were extremely small, a fraction of a percent of each. However, researchers recognized that there was a problem of power, that to properly power a study to identify genetic variants significantly associated with educational attainment, one would need a greater sample size. And so in 2016, we had what's referred to as EA2, Educational Attainment 2, which considered this time nearly 300,000 individuals. And now a much larger number of genetic variants were associated with educational attainment, 74. However, the trend of having insufficient power remained, and researchers were motivated to get bigger samples and conduct a larger study. And the landmark educational attainment study, referred to as EA3, came out in 2018 and considered over 1 million individuals, identified over 1,200 genetic variants. And when you combine the effects of those genetic variants, you can explain upward of 13, maybe 14% variance in educational attainment, which is, from a social science perspective, that's a very powerful predictor. Most recently, in 2022, the sample size was tripled to 3 million, and a much larger number of genetic variants were identified, and the total variance explained by the genetic variance is upward of 15 or possibly 16%. So we might think about the geneticization of education as the process by which educational traits, outcomes, or abilities, such as educational attainment, become defined, understood, and treated as genetic conditions. So I suggested that the New Haven Lexinome Project was a signal of this. And I think that there are a variety of signals out there that are worth thinking about. So the first signal we discussed is the growing scientific effort to investigate this relationship between variation in traits and outcomes relevant to education, PhD, and dyslexia, to also IQ, math ability, and reading ability. Another key signal of geneticization of education is not just at the upstream scientific community, but the fact that it's being disseminated to public conception. If education is going to be geneticized, it's not just that the scientific community, is investigating a thing. It would be perhaps a societal shift that things that were once thought as not genetic are suddenly thought of as genetic. And so the idea that we see popular media representation of genetic research in education is relevant here, something to think about. So we have sort of low impact small venues such as Genetic Literacy Project publishes about precision education, show how to teach a student with dyslexia. Sci News, researchers identify 3 genetic variants associated with mathematical abilities in children. It's not just these small venues that are introducing these ideas, but we also, there's Science Daily, but also the New York Times, Years of Education Influenced by Genetic Makeup, enormous study finds. About half of kids' learning ability is in their DNA, study says. The Atlantic, an enormous study of genes related to staying school. Also the Washington Post, how genes influence children's success in school, how well children perform at exams are to a large extent explained by the difference in their DNA. So there's an active research initiative in the scientific community. There's popular media representation of this, and there's also direct-to-consumer genetic testing availability. So there are a number of companies, typically third-party DTC companies. Notable is Gene Plaza, a company based in Belgium. They offer a marketplace for genetic reports where anyone can send off either a sample of their own DNA from saliva, or they can upload a raw DNA file that you might have acquired from 23andMe or Ancestry. And you can peruse a wide range of apps or genetic reports, things like, there's typical ancestry things, there's addiction, health traits, depression app. But notable here, you should see that there's math ability, intelligence. There was a time when reading ability was on here. I don't think that's still available. And if someone purchases one of these apps, they'll be presented some information. The IQ report generates this image, which is a sample report of educational attainment. And it allows people who are presented this information to think about how their DNA compares to other users, to other Gene Plaza users. That's how the information is presented on the website. I'm not sure how accurate that is. So that DTC availability is what I would consider another signal of the geneticization of education. And finally, back where we started, our active precision education initiatives, I mentioned the New Haven Lexinome project is, to my knowledge, the first precision education initiative, a very early stage, early form of it. But there's also an active project at the Florida Center for Reading Research, Learning Disabilities Translational Science Collective, which is funded by the National Institute of Childhood Health and Human Disability, with a sub-project using precision education factors to individualize education with three aims, including a precision education approach to develop prediction of reading and language development, specific learning disorders, as well as response to intervention. So these are examples of things going on in the United States. There is overseas as well, at least some formal investigation into prospects of genetics in education. So the UK Department of Education published a report in 2024 that involved putting together an expert advisory panel that included geneticists and proponents of precision education to explore technologically where we stand now with respect to using DNA for tailored education, as well as discussions of where we will be in the future. The Nuffield Foundation also just recently, I believe, last month, published a report, Navigating Genomics in Education, Insights, Opportunities, and Challenges. So the term precision education gets thrown around a lot, and it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily a new term. In fact, it goes back quite some time, but the idea that DNA would be used in precision education is relatively new. And so I'm presenting a table here that is specific to talking about precision education in the context of using genetics. And I think that there's a range of different claims, some more controversial than others, that can be entertained in this idea. So maybe Robert Plomin and Catherine Asbury's G is for Genes proposes something like systematic precision education. This is where every first grader would be given a DNA test, and it would provide a profile of risk, for example, to struggle in specific areas, and then to sort of tailor education, like an individualized education plan. Something like the New Haven Lexinome Project, the PI, Jeffrey Gruen, might be more interested in something like targeted precision education, where you first identify a child that is already struggling and use DNA to assess whether an educational intervention could be effective to help that student. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a more informational precision education, where education policy is informed by the research that's going on in the genetics world. So an idea going on here in the genetics of education is that people have different levels of ability, and an education policy would reject a one-size-fits-all model. So you might have teachers at a local school district develop a new grading system that disavows that model. So these are signals of geneticization of education. The idea is not that necessarily this has occurred, that it's complete, but it's a process that is begun. And it's important to think about advocacy as well as criticism. So what are the key arguments in favor of precision education, for example? One underlying idea is that genetic prediction technology is a powerful tool that can improve educational outcomes for everyone. It's not just to, help people who already have an advantage, but really to help people who might have a disadvantage, to improve educational outcomes across the board. It's a rejection of the one-size-fits-all model of education. People just have different genetic profiles, and that says something about how they're going to do in school. Robert Plomin and Sophie von Stoom talk about the idea that one of the key ways that an educational intervention can be effective is through conducting it early. The earlier we can do an intervention, the more effective it can be. And how that's typically done is first a child underperforms, and then you assess and do an intervention. What's special about DNA for advocates is that you could identify a child at risk long before they've underperformed, such as, as early as at birth. So earlier, more effective interventions. And then again, related to informational precision education, the idea of a better understanding of the environmental influences or the efficacy of educational interventions by controlling for genetics. Unsurprisingly, precision education, or just the geneticization of education, is not without its critics. So I think important line in my own research and interests are concerns about the predictive and explanatory limitations of the science. So there is a well-known problem of portability, which regards the limited predictive accuracy of a polygenic score when applied in a sample that is different than the original population sample. And there are also issues with polygenic prediction within a single ancestry sample. So Molly Chavorsky, a colleague here at Columbia, has done some really interesting work in this area, where they showed how polygenic scores exhibit variable prediction accuracy given different population characteristics. So for example, if a polygenic score is generated from a GWAS that was conducted in women, it has variable accuracy for diastolic blood pressure. Or the age of the population can influence the predictive accuracy of polygenic scores for body mass index, as well as socioeconomic status of the population status the population sample can influence polygenic prediction of years of schooling. There's so much more to be said here. I unfortunately don't have enough time to go into a ton of detail, but there are concerns about predictive accuracy. Another body of concerns regards explanation and mechanism. So ideally, in a scientific investigation of the relationship between a genotype and a phenotype, there is an explanatory etiological story that explains why variation at the level of DNA would result in variation at the level of the phenotype. So you could think of macular degeneration or phenylketonuria, where this sort of biological pathway is clear. For things like the number of years of schooling a person has completed in their lifetime, this pathway is much more opaque. And it is somewhere where researchers in this area are making some progress and have optimism. However, by and large, variation in DNA is not explanatory of why some people do well in school over others. Regardless of whether the information is accurate or explanatory, there's this idea that it can be misunderstood or misinterpreted, or simply when presented to a person can have undesirable social and psychological impacts, such as self-fulfilling prophecies. A line of my research since I've been at Columbia regards what we're calling the polygenic Pygmalion effect, which traces back to Jacobson and Rosenthal's book in the 1980s, Pygmalion in the Classroom, which is a basic study that suggested teacher expectations can influence student performance. So if teachers have high expectations, students will perform better. If teachers have low expectations, students will perform worse. The polygenic Pygmalion effect is analogous in the sense that it suggests student performance could be impacted by the expectations conferred by a polygenic score. So in a series of studies with some of my colleagues here, including Paul Appelbaum, we did an online vignette-based survey where we asked participants to imagine having received a polygenic score for educational attainment, but they were randomized to receive either a low score or a high score, or somewhere given a control group. And we did a follow-up study with another colleague of mine, Daphne Marchenko at Stanford. We replicated that finding and looked at some mitigating factors. But a key idea was that for participants asked to imagine a low polygenic score, they reported significantly lower self-perceptions of educational potential, of competence, academic efficacy, and self-esteem. More recently, with another colleague of mine here at Columbia, Maya Sabatello, we just published this paper, Intersectionality in a Sociogenomic World, that was in part inspired by this research suggesting that polygenic information about education can influence a person's attitudes about themselves. We wanted to see whether that kind of impact interacts with or is comparable to other forms of stigma and discrimination that impact attitudes about how people are going to do in school. So again, we did a vignette-based study where we had survey takers imagine a young boy named Michael, and we talked about his family and how his parents got a polygenic score for him, and whether he got a high score. What we did for this study, though, is we randomized whether participants learned that Michael had a low polygenic score or a high polygenic score. We randomized whether he came from a high-income family or a low-income family. And we also randomized whether he was represented as a white boy or a black boy or in a wheelchair or not. So there were 4 variables to present participants across 16 different conditions. And impressively, really surprisingly, with the results, we found that of all the variables, race, wheelchair status, socioeconomic status, and polygenic score, it was the polygenic score that was most influential. So participants who were told that Michael had a high polygenic score were 6 times more likely to assign him to a more socially desirable immediate educational trajectory, such as gifted instead of general. Participants who read a vignette describing Michael as having received a high polygenic score were 17 times more likely to report thinking that he would graduate high school, and they were 4 times more likely to assign him a higher anticipated educational attainment. So effectively, in the polygenic Pygmalion effect research program, we're identifying that at the very least, in hypothetical vignettes, there's the possibility that genetic information related to education could strongly impact not only attitudes towards oneself, but also towards others. So you might think about it with this diagram here. Either a student or an educator or a parent receives a polygenic score result, and you can imagine it's a very low result. And that result can influence the attitude of an educator, the belief of an educator. They might think that because a child is at risk to struggle, that they will struggle. And whether it's intentional or not, that belief can influence the behavior, which is then internalized by the student. The student might pick up on small signals that an educator does not have beliefs in their ability or their potential, and that could in turn influence the student's own behavior. They might be less motivated to study in math if they think they're never going to do well. And then there's a looping effect where the diminishing performance goes back to reinforce the initial belief inspired by genetic test result. So this is ethics grand rounds. It's important to say a little bit about why this is important. There are a variety of concerns related to how the geneticization could be negative or have undesirable consequences, some of which we've already talked about with respect to stigma and discrimination. The idea that if we go from a world in which education is not a genetic condition to a world in which it is, then the sort of explanations people might give for why certain students, specific students or populations of students underperform might appeal to genetics as opposed to, say, environment. So it could be that if a classmate is struggling, it's not expected that it was because they have a poor home environment, but it's because they got poor genetics. And it's not difficult to see a variety of ways in which that could give rise to stigma and discrimination. Similarly, there are concerns about educational inequity. It's possible that the technology that could be very useful to tailor education could be expensive, or the educational interventions could be expensive. And that would mean that only families that have the resources to use the technology would benefit from it, which would further exacerbate existing educational inequity. There's also concerns about occupational screening. It's conceivable that maybe in Silicon Valley, you might have companies that will only interview resumes that have a reported polygenic score for math ability in the 99th percentile. And even further down the dystopian pipeline, we have ideas of mate selection, embryo selection, and eugenics. It wouldn't be surprising if there were parents out there who, or looking to be parents who only want to partner with people who have the right genetics. Or there are companies that currently offer embryo screening with polygenic information, and there are rumors that some of those companies are going to offer information about the genetics predictions of educational traits and outcomes, IQ, which could give rise to eugenic tendencies. So I've said a lot here already. I wanted to explore this idea of geneticization of education and suggest that it's, the process by which outcomes, abilities, and traits relevant to education come to be understood as either determined or strongly influenced by DNA. And there are a variety of signals of it from upstream, where scientific research is growing in that area. The number of studies every year is getting bigger. It's a thriving area of research. And downstream as well to where it's presented in media and available in genetic testing companies like Gene Plaza. And a key point that I want to communicate is that there's something qualitatively different about polygenic information or just genetic information related to educational outcomes or other non-disease related phenotypes. There are, there are genome-wide association studies of things like household income or and what's different is that these sorts of genetic tests and this kind of information is not regulated in the same way that it is for medical information. And so it's sort of uncharted territory. And thinking about the ethical, legal, and social implications of this information is very important, particularly now. The predictive capacity currently is limited, but it is growing rapidly. And the existing research really does point to the possibility that the information can profoundly impact life trajectories for individuals. I'm going to stop there. I've said a lot. If you generate an AI image of the geneticization of education, you get this interesting picture of a DNA book right there, just in case you're curious. So thank you so much for attending the talk. It's really exciting to share these ideas with you.
Well, thank you so much, Lucas. And now for everybody who has been listening, it's your turn. Let me invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions for Lucas, and we will go through those. Lucas, let me start with a question as people are thinking about it. We have one already, which we'll turn to. So, as you described, precision education is aimed at identifying kids who are likely to have difficulties in school, tailoring their education to their needs. What I've always wondered about is, do we really need genetic testing to do that? Isn't that obvious to any teacher? Which kids are having problems learning new material? Isn't the real issue a lack of resources to provide the individualized interventions that failing students need? How much, to what extent is precision education actually targeting the real problem in our education system today?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's a really important question and the one I hear a lot. We do have the ability to identify children that are struggling and to provide interventions for them now. And we do know that the earlier you can conduct an intervention, the more effective it is. The advocates for precision education, or even if it's not a sort of systematic precision education initiative, but simply advocating for using DNA, is that you can simply do an earlier intervention. Long before a child has ever struggled or even shown behavioral problems, a DNA could identify someone with a high risk to struggle as early as birth. So really, the added benefit, at least one for the advocates, is the time of identification. But also, advocates talk about stability and the usefulness of a genetic prediction could be more consistent, for example, as opposed to an environmental prediction, which is less consistent. That's the advocacy, though. Does that answer the question? It's mainly about timing.
Yeah, it sounds to me as though that still nonetheless presumes that we have the resources available and interventions that work. And I don't know, do you have thoughts about either of those?
Right. So it's one thing to identify that a child is struggling. It's another thing to actually give an intervention that is effective. And for many of the conditions related to educational outcomes, dyslexia, for example, it's an ongoing challenge for educators to improve those outcomes, and even with the best interventions to make them last. And right now, whether DNA can improve that is an open question. So it could be that uh, what's happening is the reason it's not interventions are not effective is because they're being used on people that don't have the potential as the DNA would suggest. But that's an open question of whether the DNA can actually help the situation or not.
So we've got a, a number of questions in the Q&A, which I'd like to turn to now, and let me encourage those of you who haven't yet put your question in to please do that. So I guess Jim Tabery's question is close to the one I asked at the beginning, but maybe you have some additional thoughts. Jim writes, I suspect very few teachers would say they practice one size fits all education. They're constantly tailoring materials and resources to students. To what extent is some of this precision education enthusiasm based on a caricature of what's really happening in classrooms?
That's thank you, Jim Tabery. That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that. Um, I suspect that, momentum for precision education regards the, systematic use of standardized testing, which is used across most public school systems. And that would be suggestive of a one size fits all model where everybody gets the same test. And so perhaps the idea would be if a particular school wants to adopt a genetic or wants to do a genetically sensitive school, it would be one in which there are different tests depending on different genetic profiles. And that could potentially change how we evaluate students and how they end up doing with grades. But the underlying point Jim is asking about is whether it's a caricature. That's an important one because it is the case that we do have individualized education plans already in place, and I suspect that in the classroom, educators do individualize their teacher behavior towards particular students, given how they do on tests. Maybe some students do get more attention than others. So this idea that educators are already engaged in a systematic one-size-fits-all model might not be so accurate.
Okay. Dina Davis writes, great presentation, but oddly unhistoric. We already know that people for centuries have believed that females are genetically unlikely to be good at math or science. People of color don't do well at math and thoughts?
Yeah, there's that's absolutely true. The idea that there are genetic influences on on how people do in educational settings is not new at all. The geneticization maybe precedes the genomic studies that I talked about. But you're absolutely right that for women, racial minorities, this isn't an idea that's been along for a long time. What's different about the recent trends in science is the systematic effort to identify uh, DNA variants associated with things like math ability and reading ability. There was a long time where it was twin and family studies where you could identify a heritability uh, estimate and say that, what what we can do with that information is not particularly useful or even explanatory. This idea that you can use DNA to develop a genetic predictor really changes the landscape, and it's where things are becoming much more provocative in a way, because they're suggesting that we could use the information in a way that's useful. I didn't intend to leave part of that history out. I want to acknowledge it. That's very important. It's been there a long time, but things are really picking up right now.
Okay. Joel Breslow asks, is there any proof that intervention based solely on DNA has been an effective strategy?
Not to my knowledge. That's a really important question. So I talked at length about the New Haven Lexinome project. Um, that was a very early form of precision education in the sense that they first wanted to see whether we can even identify any significant association between how students responded to the intervention. And they didn't find anything. And the sample was too small. And there is motivation to keep going from there. But right now, it's still in the earliest stage. And so the idea that we can predict response to intervention, that's still an idea. It's in the something that they're investigating, but is not realized. So to my knowledge, no, unless it's happening somewhere in the world that we don't know about. Great question.
So Betty Cohn asks, currently it seems like you're hypothesizing how teachers would react to these polygenic scores. However, have you thought about conducting qualitative interviews of teachers to ask how they might use these scores practically?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I have thought about it. In fact, I wrote a grant proposing to do that. The jury's still out on whether that research is going to get funded, but I think it's a great idea. I am in the middle of a study that involves qualitative analysis of individuals who receive their own genetic reports for educational attainment. And the results of that study are pending. But we found some really interesting ideas there. It's very clear that people take information related to genetics very seriously, and they make life-altering decisions about themselves as well as their family members in light of it. Even when people acknowledge that it's limited information or inaccurate, they're profoundly impacted by it. So I do want to do studies involving educators, and I hope I'm not the only one out there. I think some of my colleagues will want to do that as well. And I think that we're going to find that the information can have a pretty strong impact on how people think about students and their potential.
So you mentioned in your talk, Lucas, something briefly about mechanisms. And Betty Levin is following up on that, asking, have any explanatory mechanisms been tested to explain any of the associations of genes and educational attainment?
Yeah, so the research in this area is rapidly advancing, really, really quickly. And the last I had looked at it, what we're seeing is that the single nucleotide polymorphisms that are associated with educational attainment, they're expressed in neural tissue. So that does not mean there's a mechanism. That does not mean you can do any sort of experiment. It doesn't mean you can explain much, but it is a signal that is discussed and is relevant. It could go nowhere, or it could lead to a mechanism. The scientific community that thinks about this very closely is somewhat split. There are people who think this is never going to go anywhere, and there are people who think it's only a matter of time. There's no doubt that things like educational attainment, it's a very, very complex, sort of broad phenotype, and that it'll be influenced by many, many different factors. And so the idea that there would be some biological mechanism that has a large impact on educational attainment, that might be unrealistic. But it could be that perhaps there's a mechanism that influences memory, for example, that is explanatory and that does influence how well people do in school. But again, that sort of thing is not realized. Yeah.
So Rita Sharon has a follow the money question here. The dystopic predictions at the end of your talk are chilling. Who are reaping the profits from this headlong rush into the future, and what controls do you see emerging?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Rita. Who's reaping the profits? I don't think there is any profits right now. But it is important to keep in mind that it's in the earliest stages, and if the technology can become useful, it's not difficult to anticipate that people who can, companies that provide the tests could reap the most profit, because that could be a tool that could have a lot of value or perceived value. Um, but we're not there yet. It's still in the early stages, and so I don't think any profit is being reaped right now.
Not even, Lucas, by the direct to consumer companies who are offering people these kinds of polygenic scores, not necessarily um, injecting them into the educational system, but is that a source of profit even today?
I can't speak to their financials. I know that as time goes on, the number of these companies gets bigger. But also 23andMe filed for bankruptcy recently. So I don't know how that's going to go. Gene Plaza has been around for quite some time. It's one of the earlier ones and it's still around today. I don't know how profitable it is. Their genetic reports are relatively cheap. It's like €6, but it is still around. So I think time will tell. It could be that there's a real source of profit there. I really don't know.
Gabby Seplovich asks, are there studies that attempt to measure the effect size of the impact of polygenic scores versus other social factors, home environment, school environment, etc., on educational outcomes? He says, I'm thinking that something like this might be useful when thinking about where policy and resources should be leveraged to make changes.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, to my knowledge, there aren't studies that specifically compare genetic and non-genetic predictions. But when you read research in this area, people who are advocating for the utility of genetics, they often just compare the results of prior studies on prediction of educational traits and outcomes. And um, I imagine that there might be more research going on in this area, but the amount of variance explained by EA4 is very large, 15 or 16%, and that is comparable to the best environmental predictors of educational ability. And that's an outcome that has been revealed by prior research. Whether there's variation in if you compare these next to each other in a particular study, I don't know how that would look, but um, I guess I do want to comment though that one limitation of that is that that predictive capacity, the 15, 16% in educational attainment, is subject to uh, generalizability issues. It really is that predictive in populations of European ancestry that have very few varying population characteristics. And it could be the case that when you compare the predictive capacity of genetics versus environmental factors, that generalizability is worse for genetics. So it's a really interesting question, and I wish I could say more. Um, so I don't think studies have been done yet. They might be ongoing now, but there has been comparison in existing research.
So we probably are down to our last question here, although maybe we can squeeze in one more. Thomas Champney asks, is this a Pandora's box issue? Hasn't the box already been opened? Would we be able to close it? Should we regulate it legally? You know, what can we do at this point, basically?
Yeah, they're fantastic questions. So I often get asked the question of, will this technology ever be truly useful? And I think that's an important question. There are people who think it will be, and there are people who are doubtful. But it's also a related line of reasoning is regardless of the whether that information ever becomes truly useful, it is currently available to the public. And there are people who use it. There are people who get the tests. And I think as time goes on, the information will become more accurate, more reliable. 10, 20 years, could be 30 years. It's going to become more useful, and thinking carefully about how it is used, how it is interpreted, how it could be misinterpreted or misused. It's critically important that we do that now before it's too late. But I think uh, it's already happening. It's already available. You can't undo the research that's been done and disseminate it to the public. Um, and I think there was a related question at the end of that question about what should we do moving forward? What are some ideas, recommendations? I think we need to think about
Precisely.
the pipeline uh, from the scientific research being done all the way down to how it's disseminated to the public. The normative considerations are really important for not just how the researchers communicate their results, how they design their studies, how they theorize about the sort of studies they're going to do, whether a scientific project is worth the effort, whether it will provide results that can be interpreted in a way that is not misleading, all the way down to the communications of the findings. So companies like Gene Plaza have no regulation. They can tell you you're above average for, educational attainment with no caveats. But I think a normative recommendation would be that if people are going to be presented genetic information related to education, they should also be presented information about its predictive and explanatory limitations.
Great.
There's so much more to say there, but
Yeah,
I should
there's a lot
stop.
more and many more questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to. But Lucas, I want to thank you for your presentation today. I want to thank the audience for their great questions. And again, apologies that we weren't able to get to all of them. The recording of this event will soon be posted on the website of the Columbia Division of Ethics. Our next Grand Rounds is on May 13th at 12 noon. Please subscribe to the mailing list to stay up to date on details of these and other events. And we hope that you'll stick around, as many of you as can, for the 30-minute after party in a separate Zoom room. The Zoom link is posted in the chat. Finally, please access the survey using the QR code. Once this webinar is over, it will pop up. We encourage you to complete this as we take your comments and suggestions very seriously. We're really grateful that so many of you joined us today. It was a great crowd, and we wish you all a great week and hope to see you in May. Thank you, everybody, and thank you again, Lucas.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be here. Thank you.